Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're doing a deep dive on something you might not realize is so important. The White House Chief of Staff.
Yeah, they don't always get the spotlight.
Exactly. We'll be exploring how these individuals operate behind the scenes, really shaping a presidency as much as the presidents themselves.
They really do. They're the ones making sure things actually get done.
Totally. And to guide us through this, we're using an interview with Chris Whipple, author of The Gatekeepers, How the White House Chiefs of Staff Define Every Presidency.
It's funny. I used to think the vice president was like the second most powerful person, but what Whipple reveals is that the chief of staff often wields even more influence.
Oh, absolutely. To understand just how powerful this position is,
Yeah.
we need to go back to its roots.
Yeah, like where did this whole thing even begin?
Well, it started informally with aides like John Steelman under Truman, but it was Eisenhower who formalized the role. His chief of staff, Sherman Adams, was nicknamed the Abominable No Man for fiercely protecting Eisenhower's time and energy.
Interesting. So even then, it was about controlling access and making those tough calls. Then, of course, you have Nixon and his infamous chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman Whipple, actually quotes a Newsweek article describing him as glowering out at the world under a crew cut that would flatter a drill instructor with a gaze that would freeze Medusa.
Pretty intense, right?
Yeah, Haldeman definitely made an impact. And it's fascinating because even though he was connected to the Watergate scandal, he's actually considered the architect of the modern chief of staff. He really set the template for how much power the position could have.
So we have this powerful gatekeeper, but what does that actually mean? What makes a great chief of staff in Whipple's view?
Well, according to Whipple, it all comes down to this. Being able to say no even to the president. The most effective chiefs of staff are the ones who can deliver hard truths and sometimes prevent disastrous decisions.
He gives the example of James Baker III advising Reagan against tackling Social Security reform early on. Baker famously said, "Social Security is the third rail of American politics. You touch it, you'll be electrocuted." It really sums up Baker's approach. He was pragmatic and knew that jumping into such a controversial issue right away would be a huge mistake for Reagan.
That makes a lot of sense, choosing your battles. But how does that contrast with chiefs of staff who were maybe too afraid to stand up to their presidents?
Well, look at Haldeman and Watergate. Even though he helped define the role of the chief of staff, he ultimately failed to stop the cover-up, which led to a huge scandal. It shows how crucial it is to have someone who can push back against the president when necessary.
So a strong gatekeeper is vital, but Whipple also talks about the spokes of the wheel versus the gatekeeper approach to advising the president.
Right, so imagine a bicycle wheel. The spokes represent multiple advisors, all having equal access to the president in the center. This can create chaos and inefficiency, as President Ford discovered.
Ford quickly realized that having everyone vying for his attention was just too much.
It really was. And get this, after Ford's presidency, his former chief of staff, Dick Cheney, actually received a broken bicycle wheel as a joke.
Oh, wow. That's hilarious. Clearly, having a centralized gatekeeper is much more effective, but can it be just anyone? Do personality and relationships matter?
Absolutely. A successful chief of staff needs a combination of political savvy managerial skills and a strong connection with the president. You can see this if you compare figures like James Baker and Leon Panetta with someone like Don Regan.
Right. Reagan, who took over for Baker in the Reagan administration, was known for being incredibly arrogant. Whipple describes him dramatically announcing himself as the White House chief of staff before entering rooms. He even hung up on Nancy Reagan.
Oh, wow. Yeah, Reagan is a classic example of how temperament and relationships matter.
Mm-hmm.
He might have had the experience, but his personality just clashed too much, ultimately leading to his downfall.
It's amazing how one phone call can really end a career, but it also makes you wonder, can a different chief of staff actually prevent major scandals? What about the Iran-Contra affair? Could that have been avoided if Baker had stayed on?
That's something Whipple explores in his book. He suggests that Baker, with his political instincts and experience, might have been able to steer Reagan away from that path.
It's fascinating to think about the what-ifs of history. Maybe if Baker had stayed, things would have played out differently. But to understand the impact a chief of staff can have, we should also look at a presidency where that role was initially mishandled. Jimmy Carter's.
Exactly.
Carter tried to do everything himself at first, but it clearly wasn't working. What can we learn from his experience?
It highlights that even brilliant people need a strong chief of staff. He eventually realized this, and brought in Hamilton Jordan, who was a fantastic campaign strategist,
Hmm.
but not so great as chief of staff. It shows you need specific skills for that job, not just general brilliance.
So have modern presidents learned from these past successes and failures? Do they get how crucial it is to have the right person in this role?
Well, it's a mixed bag,
Yeah.
and that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm ready to dive in. Tell me more about how the role has played out in more recent administrations. Were there any big wins or major flops we should know about?
We'll definitely get into all of that when we come back for part 2. But for now, I'm curious, what are your initial thoughts about this whole chief of staff thing? What stands out to you so far?
Welcome back. We've been talking about the White House Chief of Staff, and it's clear they have a huge impact behind the scenes.
Yeah, their influence can't be overstated.
We were just discussing how Jimmy Carter struggled early on because he didn't have a strong chief of staff. Did presidents after him learn from that mistake?
Some did, for sure,
Yeah.
but it's not always easy. Let's look at Obama, for example. He definitely understood the importance of the role, but he still went through multiple chiefs of staff.
That's interesting. Even someone like Obama, who seemed to have it all figured out, still faced challenges with this position.
Exactly. It
Huh.
just goes to show how difficult it can be to find the perfect fit. And then, of course, you have the complete opposite, Trump, who saw the chief of staff as an extension of himself, which led to constant chaos.
Yeah, it was a revolving door of chiefs of staff Reince Priebus, John Kelly, Mick Mulvaney, Mark Meadows. It's almost like he was trying to prove how crucial a competent chief of staff is by showing what happens when you have the opposite.
It's a bit of a scary thought, but it really does highlight the consequences of putting loyalty above competence.
And Whipple doesn't sugarcoat it. He calls Mark Meadows potentially the worst chief of staff in modern history, basically saying he enabled Trump's worst impulses.
Meadows' time in the role, especially leading up to January 6th, really shows what can happen when a chief of staff doesn't act as a check on the president.
So we've seen the good, the bad, and the downright chaotic. What about Biden? How does his approach to the chief of staff compare?
Well, choosing Ron Klain as his first chief of staff was a really strategic move. Klain had the experience, the competence, and a strong relationship with Biden. It signaled that Biden understood the importance of the role.
And he did navigate some really tough situations effectively, like the Afghanistan withdrawal and the pandemic.
Klain's success can be attributed to his political skills and his ability to execute Biden's vision. He was instrumental in guiding the legislative strategy and getting key bills passed like the American Rescue Plan.
It's a pretty impressive track record, but didn't Klain step down recently?
He did, and he was replaced by Jeff Zients, which was an interesting choice because he comes from a different background.
Yeah.
Zients doesn't have the same political experience as Klain, but he's known for being a brilliant manager, a real fix-it guy.
So it seems like he was brought in for his operational expertise. Does that mean he might not be as effective politically?
That's the big question a lot of people are asking. He earned that Mr. Fix-It nickname for his work overseeing the COVID-19 response. He really streamlined the vaccine rollout.
So he can definitely handle logistics and crisis management. But with the pandemic winding down, how will he handle the political challenges like inflation, the war in Ukraine, and the upcoming 2024 election?
Those are tough questions for sure. But one thing that might work in his favor is Biden himself. As a former vice president, Biden has seen firsthand how critical the chief of staff is, both the successes and the failures.
That's true. He probably understands the role better than some of his predecessors. But this all brings me back to that question about the Iran-Contra scandal. Do you think someone like Ron Klain, with his political background, could have prevented something like that from happening under Biden?
It's hard to say for certain, but it's a really interesting thought experiment. Klain's experience and relationship with Biden might have created a very different dynamic in the White House.
It really highlights the influence a chief of staff can have. They're not just managing schedules, they're shaping policy, advising the president, potentially preventing disasters. But there's one aspect we haven't really touched on yet, the relationship between the chief of staff and the first lady.
Oh, that's a fascinating dynamic, often overlooked, but it can be really important or even explosive, as we saw with Don Regan in that phone call.
He definitely learned the hard way not to mess with the first lady. So how does that relationship work? What makes it so crucial, and how has it played out in different administrations?
We're going to dive into all of that and more when we come back for part 3 of our deep dive.
We're back for the final part of our deep dive, and, we've been talking about White House chiefs of staff and just how much power they really have and the influence they have and how that relationship with the president is so crucial.
Yeah, and we left off on kind of a tricky topic, the whole relationship between the chief of staff and the First Lady.
Right. It's something you hear whispers about, but not a lot of people really talk about it openly. But it's clearly important. I mean, look at what happened with Don Regan and Nancy Reagan.
Oh, yeah. Reagan's a perfect example of how not to handle that relationship. He totally underestimated the First Lady's power, and he ended up paying the price.
Mm.
It shows just how important it is for a chief of staff to understand those dynamics.
Yeah, it's interesting because the First Lady doesn't have an official role in the White House, but she still has a ton of influence. It's not just that she's the president's wife, she's a confidant, an advisor, sometimes a really powerful advocate for her own causes.
Exactly. And a smart chief of staff knows that they have to build a relationship with the First Lady one based on respect and understanding.
So it's not just about managing her schedule or public appearances. It's about realizing she has influence on the president and working with her, not against her.
Think about Rosalind Carter. She was super involved in her husband's administration. She had her own office in the West Wing. She even went to cabinet meetings. That kind of involvement means you have to have a good working relationship with the chief of staff.
It makes you wonder how it worked in other administrations. Like, did Jackie Kennedy have a close relationship with Kenny O'Donnell, JFK's chief of staff? Or what about Hillary Clinton and Leon Panetta during Bill Clinton's time?
Those are questions historians and biographers are still trying to figure out. A lot of those interactions happen behind closed doors, so we can only guess at the impact they had.
It reminds you that power in the White House isn't always so clear-cut. You have the official lines of authority, but then you have these relationships that can be just as powerful.
Totally. And if you want to understand how a presidency really works, you have to understand those dynamics.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of White House chiefs of staff, what are the big takeaways? What should we remember?
Well, the first thing is this. The chief of staff isn't just some glorified scheduler. They have a huge role in shaping what a president focuses on, managing all the information that comes in, and acting as that gatekeeper to the Oval Office.
Right. And the second thing is a successful presidency often depends on the work that the chief of staff does behind the scenes. They're the ones keeping things running smoothly, dealing with crises, and making sure the president's vision actually happens.
And don't forget about the First Lady. A good chief of staff knows she has a lot of influence and built a strong relationship with her.
It's been a fascinating journey getting a glimpse behind the curtain at the White House and seeing how complex this chief of staff role really is. And if you want to learn more about it, I highly recommend checking out Chris Whipple's book, The Gatekeepers. It's full of great stories and analysis that will totally change how you think about the presidency.
Absolutely. So next time you hear something about the White House, remember, there's always more happening than we see in the news. Pay attention to the chief of staff, their background, their relationship with the president, and how they interact with the First Lady. You might be surprised by what you notice.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another exploration of a topic you might not have thought much about before. Until then, keep learning, keep asking questions, and we'll see you next time.